All right, want to welcome everybody. I'm here with Seattle Inspector General Lisa Judge, and we're going to be talking about the Sentinel Event review, and I think quite a few other things going on here in the city. Want to welcome you, Inspector General Judge.
Thank you so much, Omari. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about the work the Office of Inspector General is doing and the Sentinel Event review process that we're putting together. So thank you.
All right, very welcome. And welcome here. First off, a lot of people don't even really know that there is an Inspector General. And I think that maybe we should kind of start at the beginning. Maybe you can briefly tell everybody about yourself, how you landed into this position, and then we'll talk more about the office.
Sure, yeah. So I come from a background of being a lawyer inside a police department back in Tucson, Arizona. So I'm not an inspector general by trade. I didn't know a whole lot about inspector generaling when I came here, but I've been working kind of, inside and behind the scenes for a long, long time, for 20 plus years before I came here, just trying to help police departments be better, be the best that they can be. And so when this opportunity opened up and Seattle had created an Office of Inspector General, it was really an important opportunity that I saw to do that kind of work on a much larger scale in a city that seemed like it really cared about constitutional policing and about having the right kind of policing for the people of Seattle. So it was a really good opportunity for me when this came along and the city of Seattle created this office.
Why did the city of Seattle create the office?
Great question. As most folks probably know, the city of Seattle has been under a consent decree with the Department of Justice being overseen by the federal court since 2011. So as part of the city of Seattle's efforts to keep improving and doing as much as they could, even beyond the consent decree to advance police accountability, they passed an ordinance in 2017. And people are probably they're more familiar with OPA and CPC. Those groups had been around, and CPC was a creature of the consent decree. OPA, the Office of Police Accountability, had been around longer than that. The ordinance that was passed by the Seattle City Council in 2017 sort of formalized and changed a little bit those two entities, and then created the Office of Inspector General. So they created this three-part system for the City of Accountability that gave us all somewhat overlapping but different roles in police accountability here.
Right, and so you're Seattle's first Inspector General?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, and maybe you can explain a little bit more then, what is the ecosystem, the oversight ecosystem? You mentioned the OPA, and a lot of people definitely know about them. I'd say secondly after that, CPC, and then OIG as far as public awareness. But if you could kind of break down the ecosystem for our viewers.
Absolutely, yeah. We've been referred to as a three-legged stool of accountability. So essentially, the OPA has, for a number of years, had responsibility for individual officer misconduct. They're the entity that investigates whether officers committed misconduct or violated policy, and they make findings and recommendations to the chief so that individuals can be held accountable for misconduct. The CPC, the Community Police Commission, has been charged with infusing this whole system with the voice of community, with channeling community concerns into oversight of SPD in terms of whether policies are appropriate, whether they're adequate, training, those kinds of issues. So CPC has been community voice. And the Office of Inspector General was created to have systemic oversight of SPD and OPA to make sure that, while you've got individual officer misconduct being handled and community engagement and voice is handled, somebody to be responsible for the systems of SPD to make sure that they're efficient, that they're effective, and that they're ensuring that SPD is delivering constitutional policing to the community of Seattle. So we're the systems people.
Right, and this might be a question for later actually on my list, but it brings us something interesting. If you're responsible or accountable for the systems, then does your office also work with people like the city council? We see the city council try to pass laws that impact different systems and the way that SPD operates?
Yeah, we have, we refer to ourselves as partners, the accountability partners, and so we do work with all the various stakeholders in the city. I think it's important to point out that when the City Council created these three entities and created the structure, they made my office, the Office of Inspector General, and CPC independent of really any of the other branches of government. So I and my office don't work for the mayor. I report to the City Council, and so I essentially report to the community of Seattle by virtue of reporting to elected officials.
Is who you're accountable to and who your office is accountable to.
Yeah, I'm accountable to council, but that means I'm accountable to the city, to the residents of Seattle. So I was appointed by council. I can be removed by council for cause, but otherwise I work for the people.
Right. I would say that right now in the general public, and not speaking for everybody in our city, of course, but people don't have a lot of faith. And especially people know OPA, and so that's the number one thing that people throw out when it comes to oversight. And I've talked to Director Meyerberg quite a few times. I brought the same issue up to him. Like, man, people one, don't really have a lot of faith. Yeah. Two, they don't believe that you can actually do anything. I'll just ask you straightforward, like, why should people have faith or any confidence in your office? What are some of the things that people might be able to jog on their memory and know, like, oh, okay, this is what the Inspector General's office has done. Why should people believe in the Inspector General's office at all? Yeah,
completely acknowledge that trust between community and government is probably at an all-time low right now. So the only way that I've really found that you can foster trust and legitimacy is to do your work in a transparent way, to be open, to invite people to come and partner with you and work to help build things. So my office is certainly the new kid on the block in accountability, and we're trying to build a body of work that demonstrates that we're really getting into SPD and we're willing to dig deep into the issues that people care about. So I guess for me, it's important to acknowledge that I can't just presume that people are going to trust my office or to ask even for trust. All I can do is build work and work with people in a way that establishes and builds a relationship of trust and legitimacy. So one of the ways that we're trying to do that with our review of SPD's protest response over the past summer is to create a first of its kind here in Seattle review process that involves community, both in setting up the process and in sitting at the table and reviewing what happened over the summer, and also in making recommendations to SPD to hopefully find ways to do things better and not have similar results that we had last summer.
Right, and before we get into the Sentinel Event review, one of the things when Director Meyerberg at OPA with his office, when they make a recommendation, and we saw some of the recommendations, or the findings, I guess you would say, this summer. And one of the findings was the child who got hit with pepper spray. Another finding was the knee on the neck at the T-Mobile store, and some of these other things. It always says, has it been to the Inspector General? So as part of what you do, also reviewing the OPA finding on individual officers before it goes to the chief or after it goes to the chief? How are you involved in that process so people can understand, when complaints come in and we see on the finding that it says that it's gone to the Inspector General?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question that I'd like to talk about. So what we're charged with in terms of reviewing OPA's work is when a complaint comes into OPA, they make a decision about what to do with that complaint, whether there's enough information there to pursue an investigation, whether they've got enough information up front to make some decisions about whether it's a valid complaint or not, or how they're going to handle it. So we review that classification decision to make sure that they're not missing something, and to make sure that if there's anything there to investigate, that they take it and they do a full investigation. So we assess it at that stage, and then once they've done their investigation, and we provide feedback all the way through the process. So, if there's something that we think is deficient, maybe they haven't made enough attempts to contact a complainant, or they really should go speak with somebody else that they haven't done so. We provide them continual feedback through the case, but we review the completed investigation to make sure that there's no bias, to make sure that it's been thorough, and that they've met timelines that are set by the contract and other rules. So we have kind of a set parameter of things that we look at. I don't review Director Meyerberg's decision making. So much like I don't get to tell the chief of police how to make operational decisions for SPD, I don't get to tell OPA how they make their decisions or decide for them. I can identify deficiencies in what they've done and areas that they need to focus on and improve on.
Right, okay. Because we see these findings. We're waiting for the next batch of findings to come out. I think the whole city is around a lot of stuff around the protest, and we'll be interested to see that. So
if I could just add
sure.
One thing about that, Omari. A lot of times people will see a decision that's come out of OPA and they're not happy about it, but really OPA is making a decision about whether an officer violated policy or not. So, if there's a decision that's made by OPA that people are unhappy about, it's probably more a problem of that the policies need to be fixed or implemented or something. And so it's, Director Meyerberg's analysis is also limited by the system. So he's the one that tries to weed out bad apples, if we're going to use an analogy. My job is to look at things like the barrel and how long the apple's been in there and who put the apple in there and things like that, the systemic parts of it. So if he finds, let's say, in the macing of the pepper spray of the child incident this summer, that the officer did not violate policy, that's the limited environment he's working under. My job now, and with Sentinel Event Review, this is one of the things we're going to look at, is what's the broader issue? Because even if it's not a violation of policy, that's an outcome that we don't want in our community. I think we can all agree that pepper spraying a child is a bad thing. So what can we look at beyond that individual officer systemically to make sure things like that don't happen again?
Right, yeah. Well, I think that generally in policing, a lot of what we hear is just that, hey, I was just doing what the policy says.
Yeah.
And Seattle, more than a lot of law enforcement agencies, either here in King County, one of the things that we found in some other agencies in our county is that the culture around the policy of it is much less, and officers are able to be like, hey man, I'm within policy.
Sure.
And so I think I get what you're saying as to your office is like, okay, well man, let's look at policy. And while Meyerberg is looking at, let's look at this specific incident of this person, are they within the policy? And you're looking at a bigger thing is, does this policy fit? Was this a policy we want in our city?
Yeah. Is it adequate? Is there something other than the officer just deciding to make a bad decision that day or deciding to commit misconduct that can be fixed or improved to limit the likelihood that something like that's going to happen in the future?
I had a question for you later on here, but I really want to be able, once we get into this event review, kind of stay there. So we'll move this up. When you talk about recommendations around policies and systems in policing, we know here, Seattle maybe more than some other cities across America, that the police union is very vocal. The police union here has a lot of influence. The current union, the current president, Mike Solon, he was voted by 70%, an overwhelming number of officers voted to make Mike Solon president. How does your office, if it does, maybe you can tell us how your office works or communicates with the union in general? How does the union fit into this ecosystem? Especially right now, they haven't changed anything in Olympia. When you talk about collective bargaining and all these other things
Sure.
that are in the contract, how do you fit all that together? Where do you fit into it?
Well, I mean, just in terms of your first question about how do we communicate with them, I always find that it's easier to get people to go along with things that you want them to do if there's a partnership or there's some sort of, working with that person. So my office has tried to maintain communication with both unions, the command union and with SPOG. So I think just, trying to keep open lines of communication and at least letting them know what we're doing so that there's notice on their side. I think the bigger question, though, is that authorities that were given in the ordinance to my office, to the OPA, were curtailed by the last collective bargaining agreement with SPOG. And so, I think the bigger question really is, are there things that the state legislature can do or that can be achieved in bargaining that ensure that accountability entities have the right authority and the legitimacy to do their work without being shortcutted or hamstrung by collective bargaining agreements. So, it's gonna take an effort on a lot of fronts to make some changes so that powers that police accountability entities need to have to do our jobs is there and can't be bargained away.
Yeah, I mean, can accountability be negotiated?
It shouldn't be negotiated. If there is a system in place to hold people accountable, they shouldn't be able to opt out of it. That seems pretty intuitive to me.
Right. So this Sentinel Event Review, maybe you can tell us first, what's a Sentinel Event Review and putting it into perspective of maybe other kinds of events that occur that people might be familiar with?
Yeah, so the concept really comes from the airline industry and the healthcare industry, where if you have a bad outcome, like a train derailment or a plane crash or a death on the operating table, those industries are really good at taking that event and saying, all right, let's take individual misconduct out of it and let's really break down the systems and get to the root causes of how something that terrible could have happened so that we can fix those things upstream and keep, potentially a similar thing from happening in the future. So it's been used in those industries for a number of years. It has obvious benefits to law enforcement in situations like officer-involved shootings, fatal pursuit kinds of situations, things where community has suffered a harm and there's a reason to take a look at that event and go back and try to do everything we can to keep a similar harm from happening again. It had always been my intention when I came here to try to build that kind of process with community, and I think having community as a part of something like that is really essential to its success, and it's essential to its legitimacy in terms of the findings and the recommendations that come out of it. So I had always thought, and I came from a jurisdiction that used this particular method with officer-involved shootings to, really dig down deep into the systemic factors that contribute to those things and try to keep them from occurring in the future. Obviously, with the events that happened over the summer, it became really clear to me that any sort of review that we were going to do needed to involve community, needed to be as holistic as possible, and really try to get down to the bigger picture issues that were contributing to the negative things that were happening day after day over the summer.
Right. Has a Sentinel Event Review ever occurred in Seattle before?
Never. Not to my knowledge. I mean, I can't speak to the entire history of the city, but I believe it's a pretty novel approach to problem solving and getting down to the bottom of something that was harmful to the community.
Right. I think that the people, you gave some examples, but I think people might even when you talk about like a bridge failure, and you talk about different things that has a massive impact on people and on community.
Yeah.
People they all go all the way back to the bolt manufacturer. You
Yeah.
know, did the sediment test? Did they test the sediment deep enough to see if it could hold the bridge?
Yep.
Where's the capacity of whatever? It's reconstruct. I watched this show. It's probably a bad habit because I used to fly a lot, called Air Crash Investigation.
So you know all about this.
Right,
thing, yeah.
you know, and the plane goes down, and sometimes it's years.
Yeah.
I remember the Air France investigation over the Atlantic. It was years, and they put it all together, and they actually figured out like what occurred because they looked at every single thing about it. And I'm assuming kind of with this Sentinel Event review, I'll be honest with you. I you know, of course, the sound of it, I think no matter how people feel about the protest, I have my own feelings, of course, but I think that everybody in the city wants answers, and could agree with that. But ma'am, I'll be honest with you, it seems like that's a heavy lift. And we talked about your office briefly in the beginning. How are you guys gonna go through, even if we just stuck on the first 6 weeks of all these things that occurred, of every flashbang that was thrown, every use of the spray, I mean, the release of gas, there's so many different things that happen. Is your office even ramped up for something like that? Do you have the people prepared to do that? Do the people know how to investigate something like that in the sense of the conversation and the information that you're trying to gather?
Sure. Well, for one thing, it's a collective effort, right? So we're relying on, you did a lot of work to document what was going on all summer. So, you know, there's a wealth of information out there from community, from footage that people were putting out there from social media, and from SPD and other government entities that were, you know, so we're compiling and aggregating all of that information. And you know, you're right, it's a massive undertaking. I have a fairly small office, and so we are doing everything that we can to shed as much light on those events as we possibly can for community. But you know, unlike an airline crash or something like that, those are defined events. And as you are well aware, we had event after event after event, day after day after day. So essentially, we've got this whale that we've got to try to eat one bite at a time with community panels. So what we've done is start looking at that data on a timeline and picking out incidents where there were particularly high uses of force and arrests and incidents of concern that were identified by community, and taking those in sets and having a panel that's comprised of community representatives, experts, and police officials, and going through those things. You know, and I think you identified like getting down to the nuts and bolts, literally, of why things happened, and doing root cause analysis. So it's going to take, we've started already, we started the first panel, but it's going to be a process of working through the events of last summer with these panels that we're putting together.
And so, and I just wanted to clarify, because you know, I'm sitting here talking to the Inspector General of the police department, right? And I just want to make sure I'm understanding your role and what you're talking about with this Sentinel Event review. And I don't really talk of all the stuff that we went through, Converge Media with the Seattle protest, you know, Pink Umbrella, all that kind of stuff, it's whatever. But the one day that sticks out, that's right there, is burned into our memory, is actually July 25th. And that was after the chop was cleared, and that was the day that we really feel like the media was targeted. I got it on tape. We got spray painted blue everywhere with all this stuff. What you're saying is that your role isn't necessarily to be like, yes, this officer right there threw this flashbang, and if it was in policy or out of policy. Your job, in a bigger sense, is to be like, man, should our policy be that flashbangs should be thrown when this kind of thing occurs?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and we've already, you know, done some work for City Council at their request, both in terms of putting together a report about what kinds of less lethal weapons were used, especially in the early parts of the protest, and recommendations when council was considering legislation about, you know, how those kinds of weapons should be used in future protests. So yes, what's going to come out of this are additional findings and recommendations that include community people at the table taking a look and breaking down those events, and certainly July 25th will be one of great interest to everybody, but we'll be looking at those to keep on refining how SPD operates, what kinds of weapons they can use, how they use them, what kinds of accountability on the back end for decision making there will be. There are all kinds of issues that need to be addressed, obviously.
So why this approach, though? I mean, it makes sense. It's like we said, if airliner crashes, everything goes back into it. They reverse engineer. They try to put the plane back together. They try to figure it out. I mean, it makes sense, but why the Sentinel Event Review approach, and why now? And people might be like, hey, well, we've never done it before. Why do we need to do it now?
Sure. Well, I would hope that we could all agree that what we've been doing up to this point doesn't seem to be working, because I keep hearing that we're having the same conversations over and over and hearing the same recommendations over and over. And so we have an opportunity to do something different, and this is an attempt to do something different, to try to problem solve in a forward-looking, forward-thinking way. Certainly individual accountability for misconduct and wrongdoing is an important part of accountability. It's important for people to believe that there are consequences for wrongdoing. This particular review that we're putting together is forward-looking. It's not about retribution. It's not about punishment. It's about figuring out what went wrong, what happened, and fixing it so that when these kinds of events happen in the future, when people go out into the streets to exercise their constitutionally guaranteed right to First Amendment protest, that the same things aren't going to happen again. So trying something that's pretty novel and experimental, but a different way to try to see if we can actually get to a different place.
Right. And it's real interesting. The last 6 months, I say on the morning update show, it's kind of, we always talk about both sides in America now. I think there's so many sides than just both sides. And those are the polarizing sides, maybe. But, you saw a good part of America early on, and with the protests around the value and awareness and the value of Black lives. And you had one group of people come out and they talk about, these less than lethals are good, they should be used, keep these protesters there. But now when the protests shift to maybe another political ideology, and you see protests, not even Washington, D.C., but even in our own state capital, or down there in Salem, Oregon, where you see the Salem police or the police Olympian, and they're using the flashbangs, and they're using everything. And then, you know what I'm saying? It isn't until something happens to somebody that they, within their ideology, that people really think about these things. And even I talked to Kevin Schofield from SCC Insight, and he talked about how there's kind of been a shift in city council where early on they were like, get rid of all less lethals, get rid of tear gas, get rid of everything. Then we saw what happened here in Washington, D.C., and now they're thinking differently, because at first you might think that, it's just the police impacting us. But then if it's like, what if you're getting chased by somebody else? Would you want the police to be able to have those tools? I only bring that up because this might actually, with every crisis, there's an opportunity. And right now, this window might be an opportunity where both sides can kind of actually have a conversation at the same time that's relevant, because both sides are seeing now the impacts of police and less than lethal and exercise of First Amendment rights and things like that. Absolutely. And I think one of the critical things that the review panels have to do is make sure that we're looking at disparity, right, in how those tools and weapons are used against either side. So there's a disparity lens that has to be put on this. I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you. And what was the other thing I was going to say? You gave me a compliment and you totally made me lose my train of thought. You're a public official, so I'm sure you don't get many compliments. So it was a little bit of a shocker. We have to be looking at it that way, and I think you want to make sure that everybody's got the right tools to handle the situation in a way that's going to require the less, as less use of weapons as possible and force as possible.
But one of the other critical things that seems to be missing is back-end accountability for decision-making about using those tools. And individual officers, when they use force, have to provide their own justification about why they did that, like what they were perceiving at the time, why they thought that level of danger was necessary. It was necessary to use the force they did to counteract that. But when you start talking about protests where there can be decision-making at higher levels about using, force on a larger scale where there's no real assessment of whether it was necessary, whether it was appropriate, I think there needs to be a lot more work done to make sure that there's accountability for the decision-making about using less lethal weapons in a crowd context.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, Seattle, I'm sure like a lot of other cities across America, especially Seattle and what we saw here, I think it's a lot of conversation to be had. And really what's interesting here, at least in my perspective, and I'm sure, like you said, you're talking to community and community members. And one thing that I haven't seen the city do, and I'm not kind of throwing you out here to judge the city or not, I know you have your restrictions on things you can say, but I never really heard the city. I didn't expect the city to apologize to protesters. You know what I'm saying? That's not what they're going to do. But I never really heard the city apologize to just the people who lived in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. It's a misconception that the Seattle Police Department tear gassed protesters. The Seattle Police Department tear gassed a whole neighborhood that had protesters in it. Mm-hmm. And thousands of people who had nothing to do with that protest. People were in there with their kids. Their kids were breathing tear gas. People, coffee shops, restaurants, and some of everything else. And I only say that is that when you're talking about a Sentinel Event review, and hopefully, and we'll stay more on it. Hopefully, you're looking for truth and reconciliation and things like that. But the city has never even just said, man, you know what? This wasn't okay. This was not all right. And you can see where that brings up doubt in the general public. If they won't even just come out for the people who was just chilling at home and was impacted, how can somebody really have an expectation that the city government, which you're an extension of, is really gonna go and come through on the other side of this with something meaningful? And I don't know if I know there are some gag orders, and maybe you can kind of explain to that, the limitations that public officials might have of what they can talk about and what they can't talk about. But it just seems to me like, man, all this time, there's been no real effort. I know people have popped up there, a chief has popped up there or a mayor's popped up there, but nobody's come out and said, man, we've gassed a whole neighborhood several times on several days,
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. In terms of just your question about what officials can and can't say, there are some things that were prohibited by law from talking about. If there's an open OPA investigation, there's an ordinance that says only the OPA director can talk about the details of that. So, some of those things might be at play, but I totally think you're right about the fact that there has to be an acknowledgement on the part of government about harm, right? You can't move past harm until you acknowledge harm. And so I'm trying to acknowledge that in my own work and in my own little corner of this. And it's actually a fairly big corner when you talk about being in charge of this review process for the summer's protest events, but I'm trying to acknowledge and build that in to our process. The first panel started with a day of peacemaking circle, just so that people could start seeing each other as human beings and acknowledging that harm happened and being able to talk to each other and problem solve in a different way. You brought up truth and reconciliation, and I think that is probably going to have to be an integral part of how the city rebuilds trust with community. This particular Sentinel Event review process is really more about like the what and the why of what happened, but there needs to also be an aspect of the relationship component of trust that was broken between government and community, and some effort to come back and start building bridges back to that. So I completely agree with you, and I don't know if I answered your question
you did.
or not.
I mean, well, you know, because one thing that we noticed there, and I'll be honest with you, people have the different American experiences and different experiences even here in our own city. But what happened there was the people who were protesting, especially you talk about June 1st, up there at the Capitol Hill, the Western Barricade, June 1st, June 2nd. Those were people who, when I interviewed them, those were the people who were they were in shock. Not so much the gas, they got over the gas, you know, got their eyes out, everything else. They just couldn't believe that in their own neighborhood that there'd be gas. And I'm not even talking about the protesters. Some of the protesters too really lost it, but just people. And so they lost faith not only in police, they lost faith in the city of Seattle, and they lost faith in our government, our country as a whole. It's a lot of people who were impacted on multiple layers on that. You know, some people who've always kind of known what was up, but there was a lot of people up there on that hill who just, you know, could never in a million years think that would be the outcome, especially people who weren't involved in any kind of protest at all. The other thing I was going to point out is that I know that you said that you said there's an ordinance when OPA has an open investigation, then people can't speak on that. There's people like yourself, people like the mayor, people like the chief of police. Right. And, you know, just context kind of pointing it out that, my opinion, that's a very damaging ordinance. Because what happened is that on July 25th and on several other days, we saw Mayor Durkin, at the time Chief Best, and they would have a press conference. And their press conference would be very detailed. At this time, protesters did this, and somebody did this, and they broke a window there, and we found a van here. And then reporters would be like, Mayor Durkin, well, we see here that officers did this. We see this flashbang to someone's head over here. We see this and that. And they could never even acknowledge anything. They go from a whole detailed breakdown of what they said protesters did and what they documented. But when it came to an issue of police, they're like, just talk to OPA. And so then that feeds into, they're dumping it on OPA. OPA's not going to do nothing. And so it's perceived by the public that that's just an escape route for politicians. And it seems like, and so, so I guess if the tear gassing was automatically goes under OPA, that also prevented the mayor, I guess, by ordinance, from just coming out and saying, hey, this is wrong. This isn't who we are as a city. We shouldn't tear gas our people. I don't know, and I don't know if you can speak on that, but it seems like that ordinance, at least right now, is probably well intended. But in what we've gone through with a city, all that it did was give the city officials, either intentionally or unintentionally, just an escape route to say, go talk to OPA.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see that would be, something that you could, that would be a takeaway from that. And to answer your question, I don't think that ordinance is an impediment to an official coming out and saying, we shouldn't have done this isn't okay, in a larger context, right? I mean, the ordinance prohibits anybody but the OPA director from talking about the specifics of a case. I just think that maybe the sensitivity around that ordinance and everybody trying to make sure that they don't, step over the line with that ordinance has led to perhaps a situation where people are unwilling or reticent to come out and talk about larger issues like that. But I'm in agreement with you that there needs to be acknowledgement of those things, and there needs to be, constant assessment with government of, are we doing the right thing? What are we doing, and is it right? And should we be course correcting? Should we be, thinking about different ways and acknowledging when you've not done things the right way and it's caused harm to community? So I'm in agreement with you. I would hope that maybe there can be discussions about what the real limitations are that ordinance puts on people, whether there needs to be some revisiting of that. I mean, I understand the legitimate concerns about, people coming out and prejudging issues or, coloring public opinion one way or the other. So I think you're right. I think it's well-intentioned, and there are some things that, you get a benefit from it, but there needs to be a larger conversation about acknowledgement of harm to community and willingness to change course instead of getting dug in.
So the Sentinel Event Review, and you kind of touched on, you said it's community, there's experts, there's people from the city. Maybe you can give a little bit more detail as to, is this, so it's a panel, or is it how many people are on the panel, what kind of makeup of community, what kind of experts, what kind of city officials or employees are on it?
Sure. If I could just go back a little bit to our conversation about the crowd dynamics before we move on to that. This Sentinel Event Review isn't the only work that OIG is doing to break down what happened over last summer. We're also working with a crowd psychology expert from the UK, who's really walking us through things that motivate a crowd and things that legitimize or delegitimize governmental action with crowds. And so we're hoping that some of the companion work that's gonna happen that will help the panel will also be really informative about the summer as a whole, like what was changing with how the crowd was reacting, with what was motivating the crowds that were coming out, and whether what SPD was doing was productive or counterproductive. And I think there's a pretty good sense that it was counterproductive. And the day that you point out, June 1st, it's interesting because in talking with the crowd psychologist, there may have been people out there for different reasons, but when force was used by SPD in a way that was viewed as not legitimate by everybody, it tended to bring together and galvanize people who weren't even out there for the same reasons it galvanized them against the illegitimacy of their beliefs about force. And so
June 1st, you had a lot of people, and a lot of people were, who had jobs and just left their jobs again in the protests, and you really heard, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter, and up to that point, in my opinion, the Seattle Police Department were representatives of a larger issue in policing in America. And for reasons best known to the Seattle Police Department, they decided to block Pine. They did that 2 days in a row, right? But when that tear gas came out, and I kept telling these guys down at City Hall, and we were saying it, that the protest then changed, and a lot of people got who weren't even protesters became protesters. We bumped into so many people who were like, "What brought you out here?" "Man, we saw you guys choking in the tear gas and decided to come out here." Everything else, people in the neighborhood who were neutral, they came out there, and the protest, it was still about Black lives, and it was still about these policing issues. And locally, Charlena Lyles or John T. Williams. But now, all of a sudden, it was definitely about the Seattle Police Department and the East Precinct. Because before that gas came out, you're right, it's a bunch of different people for a bunch of reasons. Some people were out there protesting and they hadn't got their COVID. They were supposed to get their unemployment benefits. And the system was crashing in Olympia. People came out. How can I get my voice heard? But that day, June 1st, it changed the whole dynamics of the protest. Like 100%. That's interesting. You're talking to a crowd psychologist because it sounds like some of the early feedback that you're getting. I definitely don't have any letters behind my name, but I think we're probably saying kind of something similar.
Yeah. I think that's going to be really, really helpful. Work that comes out of this, and really useful to really let SPD know, what happens with crowds and how what they do or don't do is really driving a lot of the dynamics of that crowd. So anyway.
Well, I was going to say, while we're there, I would hope that when you talk about systems and policies, what we've heard, and I don't know for sure on one of these reports, is that SPD has never had a sustained protest in a residential neighborhood and the protest is against them. And, you know, I mean, it would have just been interesting for them to come out and be like, hey, man, we've never really kind of done this before. But they've never said that. But, you know, it's one of the things that might come out of this review is it's like, okay, you guys need more a policy or a training when something that is in a residential neighborhood. Is it something that's going to be thought of beforehand? Like, okay, if we release gas, what's going to be the implication? Which is much different than when you release it down on 4th Avenue, 5th Avenue downtown, where it's office buildings all enclosed, no windows open and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think our report that we released at the end of the summer, that was one of the things that came out of that just because of the really tiny particulate nature of tear gas, of CS gas, it's just not appropriate to use in a densely packed residential area because it gets everywhere. It can seep into places where OC spray doesn't, because OC spray is oil droplets, right, that spray and they go to a defined place and they stick there. CS gas diffuses and can get anywhere. So, you know, just understanding what it's made of and how it operates would lead you to think it should never be used in places where it can seep into people's homes. And then what was the first part of your question?
I mean, it kind of hit it on right there. I was just saying and you said that you guys put out a report on that, you know, these are the things that are kind of looked at. I mean, because you don't really hear the police department itself come out directly and say, hey, you know, we could have done that better or this and that. So everybody's worried about blame, fault, lawsuit. I don't know. Yeah. But, you know what I'm saying, it would be good to know that these are the kind of things that are getting looked at. What we were talking about, though, is like, man, who makes up this panel? Yeah,
so I think that you're going to see, hopefully, with this Sentinel Event Review, SPD coming out and saying, hey, we could have done things better because they are part of the panel. I think it's really hard to affect change in any sort of organization if the organization isn't involved in the process that comes up with what needs to be changed. So what we've done is just put together a group of people that kind of broadly represent some of the critical voices in Seattle. And, you know, in a city as diverse as Seattle, it's really hard to find 5 or 6 people who are you know, representative of everybody. But what we've tried to do is engage as broadly with community as we can to have community tell us what critical voices they think need to be included at this review table and who, you know, those folks might be that might adequately represent those voices. So we have community members on the panel that are representative of the trans queer community. It's largely people of color, people who live and work on Capitol Hill, you know, have small businesses, do community organizing on Capitol Hill, people from the ID, so the API community, and, you know, people who have been in impacted neighborhoods in these protests. Trying to think, there's a really good cross section of voices in this first panel, and this is only the first of, you know, of a number of panels that we're going to have to put together to start working through the summer. So this is one little group of people. We're going to be continuing our engagement efforts to put together additional panels that provide other opportunities for community members to come and sit and help us in this review process. And then on the SPD side, it was really important to me to have representation up through the ranks. I think you've got to have somebody at the executive level of SPD so you know you have buy-in about what the group finds and what we need to do to fix it. But you also need to have people all the way down to line officers who, you know, are standing out there and have that experience. So we have an officer, a sergeant, a lieutenant, and an assistant chief on the panel. And then we've got a couple of academic experts who are helping the panel out. One is a public policy professor from UW who specializes in criminal justice and especially with racial disparity. And then our crowd psychology expert that I mentioned.
Yeah, I know that you talked about the CID. People forget. We talk about, you know, downtown and Capitol Hill, but that first night, May 29th, I was actually out there.
Yeah.
And the Seattle Police Department, there was protesters out there, and we see a lot is they always get swept south. Somehow the protesters don't get pushed north into Lower Queen Anne and places like that. They get pushed south into the International District. And we saw May 29th, the International District got tore up and zero police response, that's a whole nother story right there. It's interesting there. So how does this work, man? And especially how does this work with COVID and everything else? I know you want to hear voices, and Seattle is a pretty good city one way or another that's good for heated town halls or meetings. Everybody's in the same room. It's passionate and everything else. And now, you have your limitations with COVID. How is this process proceeding? What's it look like? Yeah,
COVID has made all engagement much harder, really a lot harder to just get out and connect with large groups of people. So we've got opportunities for feedback on our website. We've been soliciting conversations from really anybody who will talk to us or who has input we sent out, I think, probably in the neighborhood of 130 communications to organizations and individuals inviting conversations, and that list continues to grow as more people come forward who have perspectives and experiences to add. So we're doing our best just to reach out and have conversations with whomever is willing to talk to us and whomever is willing to come to the table and help us with this work. The panel itself, it's been a little bit challenging. Doing a peacemaking circle by Zoom was a little bit interesting, but oddly, when you're looking at people, the camera's right up close to faces, so it's surprising a little bit more intimate than you would expect at first. So we had our first, like I said, 8-hour Zoom meeting this past weekend, and I felt pretty connected with the panelists, and I felt like communication was, as long as you've got good facilitation, works out. So I guess the short answer is we're doing the best we can with technology to fill in the gaps where you would ordinarily just have human interaction and human communication on a personal, in-person level.
Ma'am, if I'm hearing you correctly, and I might not be, but if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like you have two things going on at once, because it sounds like you're doing information and feedback gathering for what the IG does, take that information and policy making. But when you talk about peacemaking circles, are you also at the same time trying to build reconciliation in the community between community members and city government and police?
I think for that small group, it's really important to try to build that so that group can really dig down deep and have honest, open conversations with each other. I think a broader process needs to happen with SPD and community and with the city.
So
of
you
Seattle
started up with your panel here.
Yes.
This is this is a situation kind of within your panel. It's kind of like when you go to summer camp and they just tell you to fall back and people have to catch you, right?
Yeah.
Something like this. So that's what you're doing. So then the police can bring down their walls to talk to community, and community can bring down their walls to talk to police, and then the experts. Okay, now I have a better understanding.
Yeah, so we're doing it on that small little micro level in the panel, so that group of people can communicate honestly with each other. It needs to happen on a much more global level with the city and community.
Right, and so the panel itself is getting up to speed. You guys are breaking down barriers in between each other, so you can go and do this work. And so then what's the next step for the public? Now, I know you talked about people can send in an email and things like that, but a lot of people want to talk, though. They got stuff to say.
Yeah. It had always been my plan to do community meetings out at libraries and to get out there and have conversations with folks. It's so much harder to do that this way, and so I think setting up maybe targeted groups where folks can come together, and we have to use technology to have these conversations. Although I have gotten out in small groups out in community, so I'm willing to go out and talk to folks. I was out up on Capitol Hill last week I'm here, I spent a lot of time in the summer down here talking to protesters and other folks, so I'm certainly willing to go and do these kind of masked, conversations with whomever. We are identifying as many people as we can to talk to. There may be other people who want to engage with us, and so all I can say is that I'm open. My ears are open, my mind is open, my door is open.
You said the Sentinel Event Review is here to give feedback. You've got these people together, community people. You've got education experts, or experts in their field. You have police at different ranks involved in this process. But I'll be honest with you, like as a member of community and a citizen in the city, man, the city's always sending out stuff talking about, we want feedback and everything else. Usually, sometimes depending upon what department it is, a lot of times the city just does what it wants to do anyway. There's a lot of stuff. I will give the city some credit though. Some stuff does change, but then we find people make changes haphazardly and then the change gets reversed. So there are some changes that happen. And I'm not one of them people that says nothing, that nothing occurs the way that it should here. But it's a lot of people who are just lacking faith in the process. So even if someone doesn't have faith in if they have faith in your office, like, man, this inspector judge, straightforward, great idea, great concept, great everything else. It's the final mile. Mm-hmm. That's where the problem is where people lose faith in the process. What's this final mile look like? So you hear everybody, you get this feedback, your panel gives the recommendations, then what? Then
I think that's a great point because I've only been here going on 3 years. This is a new office. I don't have much of a track record in terms of work product, but I think I'll let people judge how I handle that final mile with these recommendations. I think in years past with protests, what's happened is there may be an independent group that comes in, does some report, does some analysis of what happened, issues some recommendations, and then it becomes up to SPD to decide what they want to do. Now, with an Office of Inspector General, where we routinely audit SPD, we're in their business all the time, and we have some ability to push to issue recommendations to them, and then engage in follow-up with them to make sure that that's happening. So where's the power behind those recommendations? I think one of the big ways in which we have power behind our recommendations is if OIG's work reflects community concern and it pushes results and solutions that help community, then we've got the power of community behind our recommendations.
Well, are you hopeful as well that if you have SPD on this panel at different ranks that also, because it takes stakeholder buy-in. This
Absolutely.
is like anything. You got to have your stakeholders really buy in on it. So community has to be like, this process was good. Your academics and experts need to be like, it's good. And SPD, needs to be like, it's good. If you were to have perfect stakeholder buy-in, but a lot of times what we find here is when all the stakeholders don't buy in, things just go into a holding pattern until the next news cycle, and things just kind of move on.
Yeah, fair enough. I think your point is well taken. Where do you get power behind recommendations first? Buy-in from people who have to implement them. I think here you get it with making sure that your work is reflective of community concerns. So you get community voice behind you, and we're still under a consent decree.
And this
so the monitoring team is they sit in on our planning meetings. They'll be sitting in on the panel meetings. They're very supportive of this process, and it's become part of the conversation that we're having with the monitor. So to the extent that this work is furthering the work of the Department of Justice and the monitor in pushing Seattle PD always in the direction of
So this
better
process is
constitutional
aligned
policing.
with the consent, because that's my
Correct.
other question. You guys
Yeah.
come back with all these great recommendations and everything else, and then the monitor, the federal judge, just is like, nope, 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 doesn't make sense, can't do that. And once again, the citizens of Seattle are on this emotional roller coaster, thinking
Sure.
that they've done this emotional process to try to be able to make a better policing situation for the whole city, and then the federal judge just knocks it down.
Yeah, no, that's a really good, catch there. And so to the extent this work aligns with, and it needs to align with constitutional policing, we have the support of the monitor and, really the support, the backing of federal court behind these things. So there are a variety of ways that I think this has the possibility to be different than in years past when there have been findings and recommendations.
Right, and now you've used the term constitutional policing twice in this interview. Can you explain to our viewers what is constitutional policing?
Sure. Police have their authority because they really have a contract, right, with the people that they police, that they're going to do it in a way that respects rights and liberties that have been afforded to people here by the Constitution, both by the United States Constitution and by the Washington State Constitution. So making sure that officers are respecting of people's First Amendment rights in this context that we're talking about, of people's Fourth Amendment rights, against unreasonable searches and seizures, against, I don't want to get too hyper-technical on the various amendments here, but rights to be free from unreasonable uses of force, things like that. All of those concepts are built in to what the consent decree is trying to ensure for Seattle. Folks who've been following this probably remember that the reason the Department of Justice is in town and that the federal court has oversight of the Seattle Police Department is because it was found that Seattle Police Department was engaging in a pattern of excessive force. And so, that implicates, or it highlights that there was not constitutional policing happening in Seattle. And so all of these efforts that have happened since 2011 is making sure that people are treated equally under the law, that their rights are being respected and that they're being policed in a way that meets with constitutional requirements. I'm hoping that the people that come to this panel come because they want to get to the root of why things happened the way they did last summer. And not that they necessarily speak for a community, but that they bring a perspective to community that's different, that they have a lived experience that's different than the usual person that shows up on a government panel. So I didn't reach out and try to pick anybody. As I said, we sent letters out to a lot of people, and then I've just had many conversations with people in community to say, we're building this process and we want to make sure that we are including voices who have not historically had an opportunity to come and do things like tell SPD what they think of how they used force, to be part of an actual force review process. So talking with people and saying, what voices have we been missing, and who in your estimation might be a good representative of that kind of perspective. And so what I was looking for was more lived experiences and perspectives that would come, that's how that panel would be fleshed out from the community perspective. And so the panel really was community identifying members for us, not us going out the other way around. And it just, it came about with conversations and people in community sometimes not having a lot of trust, and having not that much faith, but really wanting to try to do something different to maybe change the course of how protests happen in the future.
Yeah, I think that it's just, man, these processes are just, they're kind of crazy in the sense that we see, and I know what Bobby's getting at, is that a lot of times it's the people, so at least in the black community, it's the people who closest to the politicians or decision makers, or say they're speaking for the black folk, and they get these roles, and man, they're not really in touch. And then at the end of the day, you know, they've appeased this government official. Government official could say, hey, well, no, you know, we had our black expert over here, and, you know, he's telling us it's X, Y, and Z. And we be the victim of that a lot in our neighborhood.
Totally fair. And I'm not looking for somebody to speak on, you know, X community or speak for any certain particular community. What I'm looking for is that they bring a perspective. And I think these are people that are not the usual people that you see at a table like this. I've tried to, you know, go broader. We have a representative from an immigrants' rights group on it. You know, people that are just different and willing to take a chance on a different process.
Yeah. Well,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but this isn't the only opportunity for a community to have a voice in this process. This is 6 people who are going to be kind of fact finders about things. You know, we fully anticipate that there may be opportunities for people to come and talk to the panel. I'm hoping that you might come and talk to the panel and share your experiences, and others who've had experiences that might help the panel have a more rich understanding of everything that happened over the summer. So it's not like these people on the panel are the only voice of community.
Really, actually, what I hear you saying is the feedback loop is open to everybody.
Correct.
Right? And you're not excluding feedback from anybody. The feedback loops are open. I'll tell you this, Inspector General Judge, is that I don't know if you realized this when you walked into this job as the first Inspector General here in Seattle, and nobody could foresee what we saw here. But I'm gonna just be real honest with you. You know, you're asking people to really trust you a lot. This is an incredible responsibility that's now on your shoulders. And, you know, it sounds like even like you volunteered for it, because you're like, hey, let's do this Sentinel Event review. And, you know, you're putting expectations on community. You're putting expectations that there's going to be outcomes. And also, now you got somebody like us who's going to stay on top of this, and who's going to be calling your office and saying what's the outcome and everything else. You know, I really, sincerely, I wish you luck and stamina and Godspeed in this process. And, you know, we don't want you to let the city down. You know, and I'm not trying to like put it, I'm just letting you know it's a lot into this. This is a big process.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely feel the weight of the obligation to community, and I hope that this offers hope to community. I really do care. I mean, I don't want to make light of this, but I joke sometimes with my friends that this was the worst retirement job ever, because it really is. Sometimes it feels like the weight of the world, and I came here to do this because I wanted to do something meaningful in a place where people would appreciate the impact of it and be engaged. I remember when I came here a couple times to meet with folks, you know, before I was hired. I remember sitting in the bar of my hotel lobby and just having casual conversations with Seattleites, and every single person I talked to knew the issues, they understood the issues, they cared about things, and so I knew that this was a place, if I came here, that the people who live here truly care about this community, and they want to work to make this something that's different than everywhere else. And Seattle is different than everywhere else in terms of the level of engagement of the people that live here. So I feel that burden, and I'm up for it. I mean, you know, what other choice do we have, right?
Just to be clear, the outcome of this process is for you, it's a forward-looking outcome for this process to be able to make adjustments if needed to policies within the Seattle Police Department.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, just by way of example, our report that came out at the end of the summer, we found that Seattle PD was pretty decent at handling crowds, even angry crowds that were mobile, that were marches moving around. When it came to stationary crowds standing in front of, say, a police facility or something, being angry, their strategies and their tactics just weren't adequate to address that. That wasn't something that they had planned for and had experienced in the past. And so, one of the things that everybody's trying to figure out is, how do you de-escalate and manage a crowd? Do you need to manage a crowd? What do you have to do to make sure that it's safe for people to come out and protest, and step back and let them do their thing? So, we are already identified a big deficiency in Seattle's tactics, that they just weren't used to stationary, angry crowds.
All right. What should people do? How do people go and either give your feedback, I guess, online? Is there a website that people can see what the events coming up are? What's the best way, or the multiple ways, for people to be engaged in this process?
Yeah, the Office of Inspector General has a website. We have a portal. We have a requirement under the accountability ordinance to maintain a hotline. So it's a regular function for us to take in feedback and comments and whatnot. So if people want to reach out to us that way, I think there may be an online survey that we have on our website. If anyone has a desire to have, somebody from my office or me come and meet with them, or have a meeting, we're open to all of those opportunities.
Right. Well, Lisa Judge, Inspector General, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Mr. Salisbury.
Yeah.
I really appreciate this opportunity, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness of the questions and letting me get some information out to community about what we do.